Hello, this is Modesto Gallo. I'm gonna give a presentation about what I title Cultural Socialization, Parents, Institutions and Territories. Before doing that, I simply want to thank the people from the Centre Pompidou and the Ministère de la Culture de la France for inviting me to share what has been a very long process of research over the last 20 years. I'm going to show part of it here, the new lines in my research in the years to come. So, some acknowledgement as part of my research has been funded by the Chilean government, and some assistants have been helping me over the last few years. And so you can see their names there. Some preliminary comments. I suggest to understand the following reflections and data as pieces of a jigsaw, which I've been trying to work out for a long time, and I'm trying to make that jigsaw even more complex. Those pieces are heterogeneous in nature as they refer to different subjects, but my argument here is that bringing them all together might help us to think more in depth about realistic processes of socialization of children, if you want going beyond the restrictions of the habitus formation paradigm, even though using it. And we can also have quite precise or detailed ideas about the everyday life of most of the adult population, as well, assuming that socialization is a never completely ending story through which we do not only shape, but also reinforce patterns of behavior. So in order to do that, I will examples of my ongoing research, but any reader or anyone interested in these topics should read, obviously, many of the people. So this is the structure of my presentation. I start off by talking about cultural inequalities. Then I'm gonna say a few things about habitus formation. I move on what is the beginning of the second part of the presentation, talking about the role of institutions, and then I finish this presentation with some words about the role of space on the national and regional scales. And you can see at the bottom kind of sort of equation putting all these elements together. First step, cultural inequalities. Socialization usually refers to a period in life during which significant learning processes take place, allowing children to have access to or get excluded from cultural contents that will later shape their worldviews, identities, values, and also opportunities. Socialization is as much about culture as it is about economic accumulation. However, before going into that topic, a very short portrait of inequalities around the world will help us understanding the consequences of socialization, even if a proper account of inequalities needs more elements. And partly this presentation is precisely about putting processes of socialization in a realistic scenario or environment. That is what I'm trying to do in pushing the current agendas forward in the second part of my presentation. Then let's talk about a few cases that illustrate this idea of cultural inequalities across countries. Research on cultural practices and tastes has demonstrated that cultural differences between individuals within society are very significant, and these differences are most often mainly associated with education and economic resources, very often this tradition called capitals. One of the cases which has been most extensively studied is the British one. By using multiple correspondence analysis, that is also very much used in this tradition, we can see in the following figure, extracted from the book Culture Class Distinction, how separated are interrelated types of practices in UK, producing a portrait of separation between those who take part, some people call them engaged, and those who don't, those sometimes called disengaged. So we have a look at this figure on the left. You can see labels that refer mostly to people who don't participate in activities such as orchestra concerts or cinema and theaters, art galleries, and so on. And on the right, those engaged, or the so-called engaged, those who attend usually to museums, theaters, art galleries. So the picture, the previous picture, upside down, and a very used type of differentiation in different society, as we are gonna see. So, in a recent study on Australia, differentiation via culture is also evident in a pretty similar way, taking part on the left and being behind on the right. It doesn't really matter if those engaged are on the right or on the left. What is important is the association between the different activities. And those associations constitute what we can call cultural orientations. So we can see in Australia, again, on those on the right are those who don't participate much in some activities. They usually don't participate much on others, and we can see here on the left those who do so many things. So doing, culturally speaking, means doing many things and not doing those very same things. Don't do it or don't take part in many other activities. Other cases in different regions of the world show patterns quite consistent, quite similar with those already seen, which come from very commonly conceived as economic advanced societies. So most of the studies about cultural inequalities come from countries like the Netherlands or Belgium or United Kingdom, France as well, obviously, as a very important country in those analyses, and United States and Australia and so on. So people usually, or researchers in Western countries, they don't usually know much about these other countries, these other cases. So data on cultural consumption in Chile illustrate the social space of cultural practices and tastes, which also works along the lines of participation, non-participation that we have already seen. We can see here those who don't do much in terms of going to the cinema, theaters, reading, etc. They are so different in comparison with those in Chile who go to the cinema and also to the theater and art galleries and so on and so forth. So similar pattern that we have already seen for Australia and UK. From a small random sample of 100 individuals with 3 different levels of education at one university in Tehran, in a work by Sarah Hosseini, an ongoing research collaboration generated the following MCA results, being those with medium high levels of practice on the left and those with a much lower engagement on the right. So Iran, we don't usually know much about cases like this, and we can see here on the left the same kind of patterns. Those who go to the theater They go to the concerts as well and visit art galleries and so on. And those who don't do much or don't participate much on theater, concerts, and similar activities, they are concentrated on the right. Then let's start talking a little bit about not only cultural inequalities, but an explanation of those patterns. And we start by focusing on habitus formation. Bourdieu's work on cultural capital is a landmark in the field of studies on inequalities, using a perspective for which culture is a key element. In that sense, his work not only made a very sophisticated portrait of cultural inequalities within French society, but also helped to construct the instrument of measurement itself. It is for both reasons that his work is a bedrock for the studies on cultural capitalization that came later, attempting to go through the same analytical path. At this point, for us, it is enough saying that those cultural patterns of practice and differentiation that were reported above for several countries are a point in time, a photograph, but the Bourdieusian account has to do with capital formation, that is, with time or that phenomenon of capitalization seen as a dynamic process. This is my way here of spelling out the idea of habitus formation, bearing in mind the notion of habitus as a set of or a scheme of dispositions. Within that Bourdieusian framework, contending that cultural capitalization is a dynamic process that needs time implies that there is in place a very significant transmission of cultural capital from parents to their offspring. This process of cultural capitalization, of cultural capital reproduction, is key in the literature, more focused on institutionalized cultural capital, educational titles during the 80s and 90s, and with a relevant focus on embodied cultural capital since the start of the 2000s. From this later stream of literature, two findings are consolidated or at least very frequent. The first one is that parents, practices and tastes have a significant impact on those of their children. That is what we might call a basic line of effect. And the second finding is that that influence seems to be domain or type specific, that is, it is a transmission of capital that has to do with tastes and practices that are characteristic or particularly strong in parents. Let's see a few examples that show precisely how associated are interviews, patterns of taste and practice with parents' cultural capital. We are going to use the same examples, not the case of Iran, but those about United Kingdom, Australia, and Chile, as we've got more information about them. Let's start by saying a few things about United Kingdom as a model that can be generalized to other countries. Cultural differentiation has to do in UK with a class cleavage. And we can see here is the same space of lifestyles that we saw before. And so we see that there is a sort of class cleavage. On the left, we've got people with working class occupations, and on the other stream on the right, those with professional and managerial occupations, the service class, and the intermediate groups in the middle. In the very same space, on the right, we can have a look at social background, and those with working class occupations, they are very likely to have parents without education, with primary education or less, and those with service classes, with service class occupation, they very likely have parents with university degrees, and they themselves have gone through grammar schools and universities. So in terms of thinking about socialization, social background understood as this educational background seems to be very important. If we have a look at Australia, this picture is even better to illustrate the transmission of privilege via education. If we have a look at the upper left, we can see here interviews with postgraduate education, very close to partners with postgraduate education and mother and father with postgraduate education. That is, those who have postgraduate degrees in Australia, they very commonly have parents, mother and father, with the same level of education. And on the upper right, the other extreme, the interviewees with some secondary education or less, they usually have partners with some secondary education or less, and father and mother with some secondary education or less. Moving from institutionalized cultural capital to embodied cultural capital with reference to practices, if we look at that kind of capital, it is also evident that similarity between parent patterns of cultural involvement of parents and children is in place, in this case in Chile. However, we can see in the following figures that both parts are almost identical in the lower classes, socioeconomic group D and E, as informality is quite common, is historically common in relation to work in Chile. It's being very frequent to use socioeconomic groups, in this case calculated by the capacity or the goods people have at home. So socioeconomic groups D and E are those at the bottom. E is a quite poor group. And this is more, so we can see a perfect image of transmission. If you want, parents and children are pretty the same in terms of practices. And this is more moderate in the middle classes, socioeconomic groups C and 2 and C3, as they seem to have been able to take the most of the benefits of the economic growth and the modernization of the country over the last 4 decades, as in general those were raised in families with the right education at the right moment. So those are really the winners, if you want, those who take the benefit or who have taken the benefit of the economic growth over the last few decades in Chile. And this is the top socioeconomic group. And so we can see here that improving the levels of participation of parents already with high levels of cultural involvement is being quite difficult. But then let's move from the beginning of an explanation, a quite prototypical explanation about habitus formation, to a model that I've been trying to think about in an attempt to push the agenda of the understanding of cultural inequalities, pushing it forward through I would say that it's improving the complexity of the elements that it includes. So let's think a little bit about cultural capital across time. Cultural capital of individuals and societies changes through time. And for that reason, we have to consider that socialization, a process that takes place within historically specific social interactions, also changes. In that vein, a successful socialization, whether it implies a capitalization of education and culture quite over the average, has to achieve what the most cannot, overcoming the real difficulties of a particular time. In the next few slides, we see the significance of the movement in terms of levels of education and intensity of cultural involvement. This provides a complementary analytical site to the previously presented analysis of cultural inequalities, which refer to single moments of a diversity of societies. So let's have a look at it, trying to go beyond this idea of transmission of cultural patterns, assuming more or less, but to some extent, to a significant extent, that things around families don't change much, what is unrealistic. So we can see here on the left percentage of people who have gone through university studies. They have increased very significant over the second part of the 20th century. So we can see about years 2004, 2006, about 25% of people who were at that moment 25 years old, they have some experience at tertiary education. And it can even be higher today. And in terms, this is about institutionalized cultural capital. If we have a look to this figure on the right about practices, we can see here that about since the 19th, that is after finishing the dictatorship, some kind of activities have been growing very fast and very significantly. So we can see here theater, but above all, what is says here, recitales, that are most of them pop concerts, if you want. So some activities have been growing very drastically, and some others like opera and circus, they are more, the line is more flattened. It's more, I mean, it's quite flat. Changes are not so significant. In the next figure, it can be seen, just having a more comparative perspective, it can be seen in this figure how important has been the change in percentage of population with tertiary education around the world. So the lack of exposition to university studies and the rules that it supposedly provides for a few has been diminishing over time. Today, socialization must consider this fact, and many families, even in working and rural contexts, are in touch somehow with this type of cultural capital. And we can see here the percentage of people, even today or over the last few decades, in tertiary education, and it has been changing drastically since the 50s and 60s. All right, then, cultural capital in society has been increasing very significantly. The context of socialization have been changing as well, or we can assume that they have been changing. And so let's move to socialization from a perspective linked to the availability of institutions, and what I call here as well the regionalization of culture. If time as a process of making and temporalities as regimes of practice are elementary basis for any understanding of cultural capital formation, socialization has also to do so much with what I term here institutional environments. This can be a way to put contents into those temporalities referred to as institutions are traditional places of cultural production. Needless to say, Bourdieu's engagement with culture was to a great extent a critique of the French educational institutions, La Petite École for les enfants, unable to overcome the barriers of cultural transmission within families, and Le Grand École as key institutions in training elites, again confirming inherited positions in the social structure. And my analysis is precisely more than anything else about institutional availability. What we see in the next two slides illustrates the territorial concentration of cultural institutions. Using data from a project by Opera Latin America, an analysis of opera houses in Latin America was conducted taking into consideration characteristics such as having permanent staff, doing their own production of opera, ballet, classical concerts, and theater, doing streaming, number of rooms, amongst others. From that analysis, it was possible to measure how relatively far or close in terms of similarity were around 100 institutions of this kind in that region. The next slide reports the findings in relation to institutions and territories, showing that there is a clear hierarchy of institutions, and those most well-known, prestigious, and with more resources are usually concentrated in a few capitals. I'm very sorry because this figure is very cluttered, but I think that is very useful for the point I want to make. Then opera houses are stratified according to the level of resources and activities performed. And we can see here, so let's please just bear this in mind, in this area here, very important opera houses like the Gran Teatro Nacional, Teatro Solís, Teatro Municipal, Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires. So the most important, Teatro Colón Bogotá, the most important opera houses in the region are over here. This is the very same space. If we have a look in this very same area, we can see concentration of very important cities in Ciudad de Mexico, Montevideo, the capital, Uruguay's capital, Sao Paulo, the economic capital of Brazil, we can say, and Rosario, important city, Santiago, the capital of Chile, Rosario, Concepción, Antofagasta, Córdoba, important cities in Argentina, in Chile as well. So it is an image that, this figure is about showing that the most important institutions of the region are concentrated in a few capitals. There are some exceptions, and capitals move to the center, not because they are more or less important. This is because capital concentrate many institutions, and so a diversity of institutions push them to the center of the figure, but they concentrate the most important ones. So besides the concentration of the finest institutions in the main cities, when we look in detail at those areas, similar asymmetries regarding urban territories can be spotted. The next map here represents the concentration of cultural infrastructure in Santiago. So this is Santiago, Chile's capital, and concentration of institutions is here in the very center of the figure, and we cannot see it so well, but this is the area, the wealthiest area of the city, and some of the institutions have been created over the last few decades. The most important ones, some of them have been moving, or new ones have been created in that area over here. And when you look at what we can term consumption of institutions, in Santiago city center, there is a very significant correlation between attendance to those with high cultural contents on the one hand, and those that is here. This is the Opera House, and this is one of the main museums in the country, and those more accessible, open, free on the other. So these institutions here. So highly prestigious and culturally oriented institutions above, and those open or less culturally oriented below. That is, consumption of institutions is also socially marked, and they are associated with each other in terms of individual preference. And it says quite a lot about dynamics in at the city scale. Are national frontiers important? By nations and in states, consistent with the findings about institutions and territories. The important point here is that national level measures are relevant, but also to an important degree misrepresent local opportunities and therefore possibilities for the development of certain types of socialization with a strong investment in cultural capital. And most of the studies up to now have been assuming those national frontiers. We have a look at comparative studies on cultural capital, we can see that very clearly. Far from any attempt to look into the details of research on cultural capital conducted from a comparative perspective and inspired by what we can understand as Bourdieu's hypothesis regarding the universalistic nature of homology, or the association between class and culture, or capitals and tastes. To put it in simple terms, our research was done by me and other colleagues using the International Social Survey Program data. That comparative analysis shows strong similarities between nations. In this figure below, working with data on capitals and cultural practices and using some sort of factorialization, we see that the dimensionality produced is so much concentrated in one dimension, which refers, according to our interpretation, to volume of capital. So we can see here very different countries. This is France, for instance, to Taiwan, and this is a dominant first dimension. In the same, sorry, because this is very tiny, but I'm gonna just spell out very briefly what it means. In the same comparative analysis, when we look at variables of practice loadings, it is also remarkable how alike they are the main ones. Being particularly relevant in explanatory terms, going to the movies, as we can see here, very similar results for the different countries. Reading books, attending concerts, and spending time on the internet, or as we can see here, or a PC. This is reading as well, very similar results. As it has just been shown, the most common comparative approach refers to a country-by-country analysis. In an ongoing study, my approach has been based upon regional data, interstate regional areas on cultural capital. Just as a point of departure, we can have a look at the results by country, and we see so much variance. So sorry, names are in Spanish. It's gonna see the names in English in the next table. But we can see here those countries like Georgia, Guatemala, Palestine in the bottom part, as you're gonna see, in terms of levels of cultural development, and so the other countries like Norway, Mexico, United Kingdom on the left side. However, the national approach, even being important, hides a huge internal diversity inside the national borders. This is what is suggested by the next figure, which shows regions from around the world according to the levels of individuals' engagement in 4 activities: cinema and theater attendance, museum visits, and library use. It is the same space. This is looking at it from a country perspective, and these are regions of the world. And we can simply see that the regions are very diverse in terms of cultural intensity or cultural development, cultural consumption and offer. And just to have a look at different regions, different states, United States, you can see here Washington, Virginia, and very far away, Wyoming, Dakota, and so on. So countries are very internally diverse. That is what this table shows. The labels are many, but if we simply have a look at it, we can get to one of the main and same points. National spaces are very fragmented. This table shows that most of the states contains regions with high, medium, and low intensity of cultural participation. So we see countries like Germany concentrate in high intensity, what I call high intensity culture. So they got good offer, high levels of consumption, but also medium and low levels. And in the case of Algeria, it's more concentrated in low and medium levels, and countries as El Salvador in medium and low levels as well, and so on. Spain, medium and high levels. Italy here, low, medium, and high levels. So we can have a look at this table and concluding that countries are very diverse. The distribution of regions is based upon levels of individuals in regions, in cultural participation in cinemas, theater, museums, and libraries, as I already said. In this figure, it is demonstrated the very significant level of association between the degrees of involvement in those four different activities. High consumption of theaters, libraries, cinema, museums in the very same space, and the other side, the other stream, low consumptions of library, museums, theaters, and these are medium levels. In order to explain the regional distribution of cultural capital, several variables were tested to see whether they could help to produce a structure that might be realistically linked to the findings. The next figure shows such progress, which includes two variables, the Human Development Index and the Gross Domestic Product per capita. Regions with higher levels of intensity of participation, higher levels of offer and demand, are also those with the highest scores of the Human Development Index and the Gross Domestic Product per capita. So we can see here those is the very same, those areas with high and medium levels of consumption, and the same in the same areas of the low, medium, and medium, low levels of GDP and HDI. And just to conclude my presentation, what I call ending to open, a final set of reflections. Cultural inequality is a global phenomenon which crosses cultures and levels of development. The second one is the socialization can be understood as a wide approach to make accounts of those inequalities. It offers convincing explanations of a very significant transmission of cultural capital. Regarding that transmission or processes of cultural capitalization, family has been a central referent and parents key actors in the production of cultural capital. In the other words, children inherit their parents' tastes, practices, and disposition. However, the limited availability of family to explain children's cultural capital formation must be an alert or a way to raise a flag in order to have more sophisticated and realistic accounts for the distribution of opportunities in society, which are going under rapid change. In order to enrich in that restrictive account, I suggest to look in two complementary directions, both bearing in mind the idea of territory. On the one hand, the concentrated distribution of the most relevant institutions need to be taken into account, as they offer possibilities of learning and work very unrealistic for those who never reach them. On the other hand, regional differences within countries are very often as important as those between these later. Inequality is shaped by the regionalization of opportunities as well. And finally, socialization goes through families, institutions, and regional local territories, shaping the experiences of those people whose talents are needed to be nurtured over fair basis. Socialization is about social justice in the first place, even though later emotions and nostalgia may sometimes oblivion of the social hierarchies who fight to reproduce themselves. So thank you very much for inviting me. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.